Thank you all for attending. Uh, this is title is the Battle of the Seven Pines / Fair Oaks, Contrast in Command. McClellan finds a scapegoat. Nice, love the title. This is part two of a two-part lecture series. If you missed part one, you can still view it on our Civil War Roundtable YouTube channel, and it sort of I think it's at the top of the chat. You'll find the link. Feel free to utilize that. Okay, tonight we have author historian Victor Vignola, and with a lively presentation exploring the topic in detail. His first book, Contrasts in Command, The Battle of Fair Oaks, May 31st, June 1st, 1862, has received high praise. So stunning is the success of Contrasts in Command, it has earned recognition and as receiving the coveted 2023 Fletcher Pratt Award. In addition, the American Battlefield Trust also recognized Contrasts as a finalist for the 2023 Best Military History Book, while Civil War Books and Authors, an independent review journal of the Civil War historiography, includes Contrasts in their list of the top 10 books for 2023. Author Vignola's research while developing Contrasts directly led to the preservation of 12-acre parcel of hallowed ground where the Fair Oaks fighting occurred. That parcel remains the only preserved ground for the entire Seven Pines Fair Oaks battlefield. His work continues as he is completing a book on the Battle of Seven Pines. New Jersey Civil War has donated copies of his book to the 11 libraries now that list our programs on their calendar of events. On that, Victor, can I turn that over to you?
Yes, you can. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction as well. Welcome, everyone. I hope you find the next passage of time to be very productive and useful of your time being here. And I welcome questions at the end. What I'm going to talk to you tonight is partly about the Battle of Seven Pines, which for most folks, the only thing they know about it is that this guy right here, Joe Johnston, was wounded on May 31st. And this guy, who everybody knows, Robert E. Lee, was promoted into command of Confederate forces. I cover a lot of this in my book in greater detail, Contrasts in Command. And as was mentioned, I'm very proud of the fact that we have the 12 acres preserved. So if you are a donator to the American Battlefield Trust, this is a good reason for you to continue to do so. Parcels like this. Seven Pines Battlefield is 6 square miles and it includes the Richmond International Airport. The only 12 acres you can go on that's preserved hollow ground is this 12 acres right here. But tonight, what we're going to talk about in the Battle of Seven Pines is McClellan finds a scapegoat. Because if you're familiar with my book, you know that Joe Johnston and James Longstreet conspired to tag Confederate General Benjamin Huger with the responsibility for the Confederate poor performance at Seven Pines Fair Oaks. And as it turns out, one of the parallels that we discover as we go through at Seven Pines is that McClellan also used a scapegoat to save his reputation, and we'll find out more about that as we go on. The Peninsula Campaign, as you know, began in early April 1862 when McClellan landed a force here at Fortress Monroe, and then very soon thereafter, with approximately 100,000 men, began moving up towards on to Richmond was the battle cry, and his first stop was at Yorktown. There, however, John B. Bankhead Magruder, with 11,500 men, was able to use as a decoy enough of these men and tactics to persuade McClellan that instead of attacking, he should lay siege to the colonial village of Yorktown. It's an incredible piece of work by Magruder to do it because he had 11,000 men and he was facing over 70,000. And as Johnston would later tell Lee, no one but McClellan could have hesitated to make an attack on April 5th. But McClellan did. Instead, he went into siege, which was a terrible thing because he yielded the initiative in doing so. And it became a siege that from April 5th to May 4th, it was virtually a month-long siege. his army dug in and started constructing methods to deliver artillery barrage to take Yorktown. But in doing so, and in yielding that initiative, it provided Johnston the opportunity, who was up in Fredericksburg, to move his army of 55,000 men and place them here outside of Yorktown. And that's where things stayed for the month of April into early May. Then on May the 3rd, Johnston was aware that McClellan was going to unleash all the artillery. 260 guns, siege guns, would have blown the village of Yorktown to pieces. Instead, Johnston pulls his forces out right underneath the nose of McClellan. McClellan was not aware until May the 5th that Johnston had actually pulled away. And Johnston moved back, and of course, we had the Battle of Williamsburg. But something I want to mention, Johnston, I gave him a hard time in my first book, and for good reason. But up until the first year of the Civil War, he'd actually done a lot of good things. When he was in command of troops in the Shenandoah Valley, he evaded General Patterson from the federal forces, and able to do so, he withdrew his force in front of Patterson, unknowing to Patterson, sent Stonewall Jackson by rail to Manassas, where he arrived in the nick of time to help Confederates earn a victory at first Manassas. And then Johnston moved his force unobserved also to Manassas. A second time that he would move his force unobserved would be in March of 1862, when he was still encamped at Manassas, but he became concerned about the fact that he could be cut off by McClellan's forces. And again, he pulled his forces back unannounced. McClellan, again, for 2 days, had no idea that Johnston had pulled out right from underneath his nose. And a third time he did it was here at Yorktown. And after Williamsburg, he proceeded to retreat up the peninsula. But be aware of this, though. His 3 times of deceiving federal leadership, twice with McClellan, also gave McClellan the impression that Johnston was not going to be aggressive at all. And then what happened is eventually when Johnston pulled back, he was still east of the Chickahominy River. And here's Richmond, the Confederate capital. And there's the Chickahominy River, which is going to play a major part in our story. But on May the 18th, Johnston realized he could no longer keep the Chickahominy to his rear. So he pulled his forces across the Chickahominy. And then following on May the 20th was the Fourth Corps, led by Brigadier General Silas Casey's division. And in doing so, when Casey's men crossed at Bottoms Bridge, they moved and established a bridgehead at that time there. And then within 3 days, they also established a defensive position that was with entrenchments. They cut down trees. They made a pretty formidable defensive position here on May the 23rd, and they received their supplies from Savage's Station at that time. Then on May the 25th, when the Third Corps under Samuel Heintzelman also crossed Bottoms Bridge, Heintzelman's men took this area, and then the Fourth Corps was moved out to Seven Pines, which is at the intersection of the Williamsburg Road and the 9 Mile Road. And the significance of this position that was constructed by the Fourth Corps was that it was well anchored on its flanks, and they constructed a very serious defensive position, which would be a major part of our story as we move forward into May 31st battle. Now, let's just talk about the command structure briefly of the Fourth Corps, because that's really what we're focusing on. Our Fourth Corps is led by Erasmus Keyes, who was 52 years old at the time of the battle, graduate of West Point in 1832. He was born in Massachusetts, but he grew up in Maine, a career officer. Darius Couch was 39 years old, graduate of West Point, the famous class of 1846. He also served in the Mexican War. And then when the Civil Wars broke out, he returned to command, and he was appointed as a division commander in March of 1862. And then Silas Casey, the old man of the show, 59 years old, graduated from West Point in 1826. His classmates Two of them were pretty notable. One of them was Samuel Heintzelman, who was commanding the Third Corps, as well as Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed at Shiloh. What's notable about Casey as a career officer is he served in the Seminole Wars as well as Mexico. He was wounded in Mexico, and then he went out west and served in California and Washington State. Um, Casey was known throughout the Army as being a very good leader and one who could train men well, evaluate officers, and he had good structure about himself. When the war started, he came east, and the first thing that he was tasked to do when he came east in Washington was the military order of tactics at the time was called the Hardee Manual of Tactics. Well, William Hardee was now a Confederate general. Stanton and Lincoln didn't like that, so they tasked Casey to rewrite the manual. It became Casey's Manual of Tactics. But the other thing was, um, George B. McClellan recognized he had a master of training and a master of evaluating officers. So he tasked Casey with all the new regiments arriving from throughout the Northeast and throughout the country, arriving in Washington. It was up to Casey to evaluate their officer corps to make sure they were competent, and those that were incompetent, get rid of them, and the rest of them to train them so that they were going to be very effective military leadership, and to also instill military discipline and training for the line troops as they came through. From August until March of 1862, Casey is responsible for having trained over 120,000 soldiers and have evaluated numerous officers. Matter of fact, the entire Army of the Potomac, virtually all of them, had come through the department that Casey had led. So he was very effective at what he did. And then when McClellan started the Peninsula campaign, he needed all the men he could get. So he told Casey, your men are coming with me. However, out of the 9,000 men that Casey had with him, over 6,000 of them were brand new. And I mean brand new. They arrived in Washington in the 1st of March. By the 15th of March, they were put on ships and sent to Fortress Monroe. So he had 6,000 of his 9,000 men were the newest of the new, the rawest of the raw. He hadn't been able to evaluate their officers. The men were not trained. The men were not properly led, nor were they properly equipped. And that's going to be a huge part of our story. As we move forward, though, he begins part of the campaign. And then, as I mentioned, on May the 23rd, the position's here, the 25th, the 4th Corps moves to this location. But it's important to realize the position that they're at on May the 25th, many things were going on. By this time, Keyes was becoming very concerned about Casey's division because of his 9,000 men. Many of them had fallen ill or died or deserted. In fact, on May the 22nd, Keyes sent a note to McClellan and it stated the division of General Casey shows a falling off in effective strength. Since March of 30th, he has lost 3,577 men, and it's sufficiently alarming. So much so that the Inspector General came and inspected Casey's camps on May the 27th and found pretty much the same, that the officer corps was bad, the leadership was bad, the equipment was bad, and that the food the men were receiving was also not enough to support them. So in other words, the division and the corps that were at the tip of the spear at this time was not a very effective men to be led. However, McClellan then orders a movement forward of 3/4 of a mile, and it was Casey's division, which is very much of a shock after that Inspector General report came out. And the reason for that was McClellan wished to use Fair Oaks Station as a depot. And in order to do that, as you can see on the roads, Fair Oaks Station is a mile in advance of Seven Pines. So in order to make this a depot, you have to make this position on its flank to support it. This is where Casey's division was moved on May the 28th, and it was not a popular move. Keyes would write to, afterwards, he stated, the position my corps occupied was not one of my selection. None of the officers were in favor of this move. Darius Couch said, the isolated position of Keyes' corps caused me great anxiety. And Casey himself, knowing the components of his division, said, I was ordered, contrary to my advice and military opinion, to move 3/4 of a mile forward. My division was pushed like a wedge into to the enemy, and it was too far advanced and much too exposed. Finally, another officer stated, why we were ordered past our best position and put into a position where both our flanks were exposed is beyond me. Because if you look at this, their right flank is in the air. Look at this huge area that he has to cover with pickets. Not only that, his men were exhausted. They have been now campaigning for the last week. They've either been digging trenches, cutting trees, and living in a swamp for well over the last month. They were exhausted, they were tired, and they were not in good shape. And oh, by the way, they were in trouble. Now, if you look at this map, it's kind of turned sideways. The map on the left here shows you Richmond, and this is the Williamsburg Road as it comes out, and it matches up here. That's the reason I placed it here like this. And this is the 9 Mile Road as it comes in. The reason I'm showing you this, I haven't developed my maps yet for the next book I'm working on, but this is where the second line was. This will be the key line that actually stops the Confederate advance on May 31st. If you notice here, it's called felled trees, abattis, slashings. When they cleared this area, what they did is they took all the trees and stacked them in front to make it difficult for any force attacking them to go through it. Their right was anchored on the railroad, their left was anchored on the White Oak Swamp. When they were moved forward on May the 28th, they had to really cut down all these trees. This was a forested area. They had to cut down all these trees, and again, they stacked them as a defensive position, dug rifle pits, built a redoubt, and everything was crunched in. They had to put their camps between their front lines and where the second line of abatis was. Very difficult position for them to be in. One of the men wrote, our Casey's division was put in the front of rebel lines about a week ago, and we have been very busy ever since. We're on picket duty every day, and we're kept awake every night, sleeping on our arms. And when we did sleep, if a gun was fired, we must rally into battle line instantly. So these men, as I said, are a high state of stress for them at this time. So let's talk about the battle, prelude to battle. What's going on with McClellan's thinking at this time? Because it's crucial. As you can see, he's got his 5 corps. They're pretty well spread out. And if you look at his thinking, really is on his right flank, because he's expecting the 1st Corps under Irwin McDowell to come down from Fredericksburg. McClellan's intent, my thinking is, he never said so, but my thinking is his intent was to now place Richmond in siege. If he had the 35,000 men from the 1st Corps, he'd be able to do it. The movement of the 4th Corps and the 3rd Corps south and west of the river was basically to provide that flanking area, but he didn't expect an attack here. Obviously, look at this gap between Heintzelman and Keyes's corps, and look at where Hooker's division is. So he's not expecting an attack. He's expecting Johnston is going to dig in and harden himself in a way that he's not going to be aggressive, because he's never been aggressive as far as McClellan is concerned. But Johnston makes a surprise. He's got 85,000 men in total. And what he does is he sees that he now receives word that McDowell is not going to be coming down into this area as was expected. But he realizes that Keyes's 4th Corps is very vulnerable. So he orders D.H. Hill on May the 29th and May the 30th to conduct strong probes along this road to find out just what Keyes's strength is. And based upon those probes, word comes back to Johnston that Keyes is very vulnerable. And also, Keyes, because of these probes, he sends word back to McClellan and Heintzelman, who's now in charge of both of these corps south of the river. He sends back word that Casey's flanks are now threatened. And he says, and the lines and the batteries of the enemy are in an arc in front of me. He was very concerned about a possible attack. Heintzelman responded, I do not consider that there is the slightest cause of alarm. McClellan is in his headquarters suffering from malaria at the time. But nonetheless, all this is going on. May the 30th, Johnston decides he's going to make an attack. And pretty much his attack plan is Longstreet is going to take 13,000 men, place them here at Old Tavern, squarely on the right flank of Keyes's Fourth Corps. Benjamin Huger will move his 6,200 men down here on the left flank, placing them on the left flank of Keyes's Corps. Rhodes will join Daniel Harvey Hill. Once he does, the attack will begin along the Williamsburg Road, smashing them in the front. Once the fighting starts here, Longstreet is to move down this road. Front and flank, you'll have 25,000 Confederates striking Casey's division, which by all accounts on May the 31st was down to about 4,500 men, and Couch's division of 5,500. So you'll have 25,000 against approximately 10,000 men with a 2-mile gap back to Kearny's division. It should be a steamroller for the Confederates to win that one. However, as we know, things don't turn out that way. Longstreet, instead of moving to where he should have, he moves down to Gillies Creek, crossing it to get to the Williamsburg Road. He cuts off Benjamin Huger, delays his attack for well over 4 hours. This picture on the right is the Gillies Creek crossing today. I'm not going to say it's the exact one that caused the issue, but it's in the area outside of the capital of Richmond, just below the Oakwood Cemetery, where the two streams that come together that make the crossing were approximately in this area. But at any rate, Longstreet claims he's misunderstood his orders. He delays the attack for well over 4 hours. But once the attack does begin at 1 o'clock, it begins voraciously from D.H. Hill. He commits all 4 of his brigades, moving them forward. But as they're moving forward, something has happened the night before. There was a rainstorm that struck the area, and it was a voracious rainstorm. It had rained 7 of the previous 11 days. So the entire area, the roads are a mess, the fields are a mess. There was ponding in the fields. It was very difficult for the men to move at all. In fact, it was so difficult that Keyes had sent back a report that morning that he expected an attack imminently. He sent that word back to Heintzelman as well as to McClellan. I expect an attack imminently. 11 o'clock in the morning, a staff officer from Johnston was captured by Keyes's men. When they relayed that information that an attack was imminent, Casey was expecting some support. However, none came, and at 1 o'clock, the attack started. And as you can see, Hill's men are moving in very strongly. But the Confederate advance moved through with great difficulty. They're impeded because the heavy rain had formed knee-deep mud in the area. There were swamp-like conditions the men had to move through, tangled undergrowth, and it made it very difficult for them to move. Plus, Casey's men put up a pretty good fight resisting them. This map is from Major Richard Maury of the 20th Virginia. They're located here, part of Samuel Garland's brigade. And as Garland's men moved forward, Maury would later write, "We reached the edge of the wood where the abattis impeded further advances, where we are now under a heavy fire." They're moving through this area and they're in heavy fire because Casey has 22 artillery pieces, and those men are banging away constantly with shot and shell into the trees to try to shatter the tree limbs above the advancing Confederates. One account says the Confederates said the tree limbs were shattered and they rained down upon us, and we received heavy musketry fire from an unseen foe. Colonel McRae of the 5th North Carolina wrote, "We passed through an open field, through a horrible fire, always from an enemy who was thoroughly concealed. The felled trees formed an abattis, which was very difficult for us to pass over. On the other side of the space, the enemy's batteries were ambuscaded, and behind bushes, his forces were greatly superior to ours, and their men were behind entrenchments." So Casey's men are putting up a pretty strong fight starting at 1 o'clock. Garland would write, 10 minutes after firing the first volleys, our 2 armies were in a deadly strife and a general engagement, and the firing was deadly. all of these regiments of Garland's moving forward, their battle lines became intermingled. There was all kinds of accounts of men serving with some of the parts of one company would be serving from the 38th Virginia would be with the 24th Virginia. There was a mix and match all over the place, but the men went forward and fought nonetheless. Garland's brigade suffered pretty heavily. Of his 2,065 men present, he had 740 casualties. His losses were especially high to his line and field officers. The 24th Virginia, including Maury, all of the men were either killed or wounded, and line officers. Only one officer escaped unscathed. The 23rd North Carolina, they lost 8 of their 10 captains and 17 of their 29 lieutenants. The 2nd Florida lost all 11 of their 13 captains were killed, flat out killed. So it was a heavy toll in here. There was a lot of heavy fighting going on in this area. The intensity of the resistance put up by Casey's men, as well as the terrain, made it very difficult for the Confederates to operate. Garland wrote, "It is not surprising that the regimental lines could not be preserved." Well, it's during this fight that a rather famous event occurred, one which Corporal Hiram Purcell of the 104th Pennsylvania would earn a Medal of Honor. And this painting is by William Trigot, and it depicts what was going on at that time. The 104th is actually falling back from the Confederate advance. And if we look here for a second, the 104th is located approximately in this area here. They did move forward and then started falling back. This depicts the scene that occurred. There was a sergeant, James Slack. He's right here. Slack was the color sergeant. And as he's falling back, he falls and he's severely wounded. He exclaims, "Old Slack has hit the ground, but the colors shall not." Well, the Colonel, William Davis, and the Major, John Grease, both cry out, "Save the colors." With that, Purcell runs forward, grabs the colors right in front of the Confederates here, and runs back. As he's crossing this fence, he's shot in the thigh rather severely. He also sustains a wound in his arm and in his neck. And as he's bleeding on the ground, he hands the flags off. The flags are saved. He is later also saved, and he gets back to Pennsylvania, recuperates. His Medal of Honor inscription reads, "Sergeant Hiram Purcell, while serving with the 104th Pennsylvania at Fair Oaks, Virginia, while carrying the regimental colors, Sergeant Purcell turned to face the enemy and save the other color, which would have otherwise been captured." And you know, the capturing of the national colors was definitely a no-no to all the men who were involved in the fighting that day. As far as the lines themselves go today, well, you've probably seen these pictures of the famous block houses that are, it's right along Route 60 in Sandston, Virginia, outside the library. This photo where it's taken here, those block houses would be approximately in this area here compared to where this photo is taken. Notice how tabletop flat the ground is. It's very flat there, as well as the ground being very sandy. It wouldn't take much for the rain to stir it up and make it terrible. This photo here is obviously taken after the May 31st battle. It shows artillery placements, but again, there's the blockhouses, and this is pretty much what the lunettes would have looked like, which would have been constructed at a later period of time. But one of the parts about this fighting is that where the Casey's Redoubt was located. Now, here's another painting, kind of gives you an idea that the redoubt was located to the left of the Williamsburg Road, near the center of a field. We had erected a small earthwork that was not as high as a man's head. It was large enough to accommodate 3 guns. In this work, 3 of our pieces were planted. The remaining 3 were placed outside of the works just to the left of it. But the moat and the rifle pits that surrounded it, they were all filled with water. One of the men wrote, "Our rifle pits were almost filled with water. When the rebels got to within 21 paces, we delivered a deathly fire into their ranks. The artillery in front and rear of us opened their fiery mouths while vomiting iron of death into the woods. The two batteries, total of 10 guns that were located in here, thundered with their stern music. The batteries fired shot and shell at the rate of 24 shells per minute. When the Confederates came within 400 yards, the artillerists switched to canister. Rhodes's brigade, as they were advancing, one of the artillerists here within the redoubt would state it was evident that the fight had been raging for well over an hour, that the Confederates now had an interest on our battery. It was our battery that they were after, and the guns were loaded and discharged. He said that they were loaded with double charges of grape and canister. Casey was inside of this redoubt helping the men load their guns and fire them, and every discharge you could see the lines bend like grass before a hurricane. Well, this map was drawn by Private Julius Bayall of the 5th Alabama. He is going to be killed on July the 1st at Malvern Hill, but he wrote this in a letter to his parents on June the 5th, and it gives the positions of the advance of Rhodes's brigade. And what he has here with these numbers, number 5 is Thomas Carter's battery, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 is the advance of Rhodes's brigade as they're moving towards the redoubt and the entrenchments that are there. But you can notice how it talks about an abattis with a fence and the swamp in the woods and the other abattis. It gives you a feel for the ground that's here. And then behind it, this is the second line. Remember, I talked about the most significant line was that line, the May 25th line is back here. And these numbers depict the Confederate advance towards that. So Bayall gave us a complete picture of the advance of Rhodes's brigade. Rhodes would write, my line was formed under heavy fire of artillery and musketry in front of the abattis. So his men were moving through this abattis, moving in a straight line. But he realized that he had to make a flanking movement, and that's when he strung these regiments off to the right, his right, and Union artillerists would comment, the Confederates made a successful flank movement on our left. In a very short time, 60 of our horses lay dead and floundering in the field. Well, Rhodes's men paid a heavy price. He had 2,200 men under his command. 1,099 were killed, wounded, or missing. Of the 24 officers were killed, many others wounded, including Rhodes. He was wounded in this advance. While he's doing that, smashing the Casey's left flank on this part of the field, Micah Jenkins has moved with his half brigade to the right, and he's actually crushing Casey's right. He destroys the 61st Pennsylvania and 23rd Pennsylvania. So it wasn't coordinated this way, but from my research, just about at the same time, very nearly 3 o'clock or shortly after 3 o'clock, Rhodes is breaking through here. Jenkins is breaking through here. The rest of Casey's men either run from the field permanently or they are regathered and reformed here at the second line, the line that was the preferred line for May the 25th. That's where they're falling back behind the second big line of abattis here. But this is the key moment. This is when victory was right there for the Confederates. This is the time that Johnston had not yet moved. Sumner is on his way, crossing to get across the Chickahominy River. Heintzelman, at around 3 o'clock, finally starts moving Kearny's division forward. Finally, at 3 o'clock, these guys have been fighting for 2 hours. He certainly heard the noise and all the music going on, but he didn't move forward until after 3 o'clock. So his men are now moving, but Johnston is not. And that is a key loss for the Confederates, because it is at this time, excuse me, that Keyes would later summarize, my right was on ground, and you can see it. My right was on ground so favorable to the approach of the enemy and so far from the Chickahominy that if Johnston had then moved, I could have made but a feeble defense comparatively, and every man of us would have been killed, captured, or driven into the swamps before any help could have reached us. This was the crucial moment, slightly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Couch forms with what he can, and that's what my book is about up here at the Adams House. And we know about Sumner's arrival. But as you can see, right around 4:30, once Johnston finally does move, when he receives word from Longstreet that his help is needed at Seven Pines, as he moves down, that's when the fighting occurs here at Fair Oaks. But it's right next door to the fighting at Seven Pines. And at the same time, right around 4:30, that's around 4:30, 5 o'clock, is when Phil Kearny arrives with his support finally. He's getting onto the field. The Confederates now are massing all of these troops, including Kemper's brigade has now come into the fight as well. So this is a very hot fight in here. They're having a difficult time breaking through this other line of abatis here. Jenkins is pressing this flank. At the same time, up here at Fair Oaks, we have that fight that Contrast and Command is about. This fight is going on less than a mile away. The Confederates are trying to break this line. The remnants of Casey's division, as well as part of Couch's division, is putting up a stern fight. Kearny's men arrive. They do a nice fight here, but eventually the front's going to fold. And Heintzelman also comes forward. Keyes has also remained on the ground. This is a very desperate fight that occurs here. One of the things that is described in one of the accounts by James Kemper, he wrote, "If we get into any more fights such as this, we will hardly have enough men left to tell the tale." And he wrote that in 1862. And we have 3 years almost of the war yet to go. Another one of his soldiers from the 17th Virginia wrote in his letter home, he wrote, "I now realize the horrors of being in war." Well, Kemper brought 2,400 Virginians into the battle. They fought for an hour and a half at the most, and he suffered 397 casualties. Such was the intensity of this fight that was going on here. Kearny's men do a heroic job, and they're forcing the Confederates back. But somewhere, and I can't figure out where exactly or how it occurred, a breakthrough occurs here, which forces the rest of Casey's men back, part of Couch's men back, and then Kearny will fall back in this way, falling back from the field. But while all this is going on, this is about the disaster of Casey, because during the battle, Heintzelman was sending notes back to McClellan as the fight was progressing. And in his notes, he says the first of which came shortly in the late afternoon after the fighting began, when stragglers started appearing back near where the Third Corps was located. He said Casey's division had dispersed. They lost the forward defensive position, and it's apparent that he lost a number of pieces of artillery. And that later he would send a note to McClellan stating that Kearny's division has arrived and fought heroically, but they've arrived too late to prevent Casey's disaster. He then concluded another note shortly thereafter stating to McClellan, "The rout of Casey's division had a most dispiriting effect on my troops as they came up, and then I soon met them at the fugitives of General Casey's division and learned that most of them had given way." Well, obviously, his notes have a great impact on McClellan, especially when he sends back a note saying that the stragglers of Casey's division had a most dispiriting effect on our men, and their troops did not fight well. Well, McClellan responded to Heintzelman around 10 o'clock saying, "Sir, you have done well, and you have done all I expected in retrieving the disaster of Casey." Well, that night, McClellan had to send a telegram to Stanton. Now, think of this. Because of his poor focus, he had ignored and not given a focus to the men that he had placed the Third and Fourth Corps below the Chickahominy River. And guess what? The only way to get a message through is by telegram. That's the only way to get a message through. And who has the telegram? But George B. McClellan. And he's got a direct line to Abraham Lincoln and Edward Stanton. And you think he's going to own up to the fact that he had a near disaster at Seven Pines? Well, of course not. So he sends a note approximately 1 a.m. on June the 1st, where he states to Stanton, "We have had a most desperate battle today. The enemy took advantage of a terrible storm which flooded the valley of the Chickahominy. They attacked our troops on the right bank of the river. Casey's division, which was in the first line, gave away unaccountably and discreditably, and has caused temporary confusion, during which some of my guns were lost. Heintzelman and Kearney most gallantly fought their way through, and our troops checked the enemy." And then he concludes his telegram, "With the exception of Casey's division, my men behaved splendidly." Well, guess what? The next day, June the 2nd, you can see it right there. June the 2nd, this was in the headlines of every major newspaper in the North. Casey's division routed. And down here, where the storyline actually begins, was the entire telegram that McClellan had sent. His CYA telegram went blaming Casey's men for their poor performance, even though they fought on their own for over 3.5 hours before any reinforcements reached them. And so forevermore, it was known as Casey's men who had fought a terrible battle and that they had run. McClellan has now found himself a scapegoat in Casey, even though Casey was a very respected man at the time. One of the accounts afterwards supporting Casey would say, "There is other evidence to prove McClellan's dispatch of June the 1st was cruelly unjust to the brave men that were made victims of the untoward circumstances. The simple truth is General McClellan, in giving to the country a hasty dispatch, it was based upon partial and biased statements before he had time to inform himself of the real facts of the case. It's our misfortune for have him blamed too quickly and rely on quote unquote official sources. He should not forget that his is the highest word of disapprobation, that a force that can force national censure upon a proud man. It should never be done hastily or carelessly." And it went on to conclude that McClellan had based his information principally upon the statements of those whom a rigid investigation might prove themselves sinners also in this affair, to which he's referring to is McClellan. But what's the motivation to avoid blame here? Well, if you look at it, McClellan, he lacked operational focus at all for the 3rd and 4th Corps. Matter of fact, you could argue that on the whole thing. He was so focused on his right flank and making siege plans from his perception of what the plan was. He lacked an operational focus. He lacked a mission for the 3rd and 4th Corps south and west of the Chickahominy River. He failed to heed numerous warning signs given to him by Keyes that his men were in trouble and the fact that Casey's division was not combat ready. He also misjudged Johnston's ability to launch an attack. But the saving grace for McClellan is he had the only telegram in the whole place that was connected on a direct line to the president's office. And boy, did he control the message. And of course, he's influenced because what about Heintzelman? Well, he failed to heed those very same warnings. Matter of fact, he told Keyes, "You don't even know what you're talking about. We're not in danger." And then he was slow to respond. So what about the casualties that happened on May the 31st, only in this area of Seven Pines? Well, if you look at Kearney's men, they fought for 1.5 to 2 hours at most. And there's pretty significant casualties, 881 men for 2 hours worth of fighting. Couch, only partial of his division was engaged, and intermittently they fought for the whole thing, 782, but they were primarily on the second line. Casey's division, which by most accounts I can piece together from the accounts from the regiments that participated, of his 13 regiments, 8 of them were brand spanking new. Approximately 4,500 men. So if you get at these 1,430 casualties, he's very nearly 1/3 of his division. And they fought right from the start, right on through. Yes, some of them ran, but a heck of a lot of them put up a good fight for at least 3 hours or so. Aggregate loss for the federal side, 3,093. And on the Confederate end, 4,000 men. You're talking from 1 o'clock to approximately 7 o'clock, 6 hours of fighting, but they lost 4,000 men. The combined losses in that sector alone, 7,000 men in less than 6 hours of fighting. It was pretty intense. So, what about after Seven Pines? Well, after Seven Pines, Casey was ruined. He was ruined, relieved of command, but he was sent back to Washington because they knew of his value, of his ability to train men and assess officers. So when it came time to think about, with the Emancipation Proclamation, that we're going to need colored troops and we're going to have to evaluate officers and train the officers as well as train the troops and to be an effective combat leaders, Casey was assigned the task of recruiting all the white officers that would lead the colored troops and ensuring that the colored troops had proper training. So he did serve for the rest of the war very effectively. Keyes, on the other hand, he didn't do so well. He was put on a shelf. McClellan hated him. They did not get along. He was put on a shelf. He did do some command functions. And a matter of fact, during the Gettysburg campaign, he did mismanage a small group of troops outside of Richmond, and then he was relieved forevermore. Darius Couch, as we know, he would eventually rise to command the Second Corps and then become disgusted at performance of Hooker after Chancellorsville, and he removed himself from command. But later he came back to serve in the West as a Corps commander. Heintzelman would serve with the Army of the Potomac through Second Manassas. After Second Manassas, he would also be relieved of command. And as we know, Phil Kearny was killed at Chantilly right after the Battle of Second Manassas. So when you look at the overall final tally for the fighting at Seven Pines, the 2 days of fighting, 11,094 casualties in total. And as you look for each of the sectors, as I said, Seven Pines, May 31st, 7,098. And then the Fair Oaks sector, 1798. The fighting of June the 1st, 2198. That adds up to these numbers: 11 hours worth of fighting, over 11,000 casualties, 1,000 an hour, which is quite significant. And as I told you last month when we talked, Shiloh, which everybody knows something about, 23,000 casualties and 23 hours of fighting. This battle, ladies and gentlemen, had the same casualty rate as Shiloh, but the only thing it's known for is this is where Johnston got wounded and Robert E. Lee got promoted in command. And that's a sham. And I hope that you all have some questions, because I am done talking. If you need my contact information, there it is. And please write it down. If you want to send me emails asking questions, you can do that as well. But fire away. I'm ready for questions. I want to make sure I save you time for asking a question or two.
Thank you very much, Victor. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can see?
Sure.
Yeah.
If you'd put your questions into the chat, we have one already. Let me read it to you, Victor. You're actually two. First one is, please talk a bit about the conditions of the main and the secondary roads at the time of fighting, and how much, if at all, the road condition influenced what happened, including the search for a scapegoat.
Oh, boy, the roads were a mess. They were such a mess that Johnston decided not to bring his artillery down the 9 Mile road. The secondary roads would have also been a mess. So much so that one of the opportunities to advance would have been, there was a secondary road that connected the Charles City Road to the Williamsburg Road, but it was so flooded that Wilcox, with his 3 brigades from Longstreet's division, couldn't use it. It was totally like a swamp, so it wasn't used. So the roads were a mess. There was a lot of ponding. There was accounts where men drowned. That's how much water was there. And what was the other part of the question?
And what did the roads in any way influence what happened, including the search for a scapegoat?
Well, I think the search for the scapegoat came from the fact that McClellan was too cavalier. Um, his belief, he was focused on siege. He was greatly influenced by the Crimean War siege that he had witnessed, and he was also greatly the Yorktown. His belief was siege would save lives rather than getting into combat. He actually wrote his wife after the Yorktown siege, even though 10,000 men either died or became sick for the rest of the campaign. He wrote to his wife, I am a hero for how many lives I've saved by placing this place in siege rather than attacking it. Well, you could argue that point very clearly.
All righty. Next question. Your assessment of McClellan's CYA actions are pretty solid. In addition to the motives for his assigning of blame in his role as Army commander, what can you conclude about McClellan, the man?
Well, I'm not a big McClellan fan. I'm not a big McClellan fan. He his desire to save lives actually costs lives, in my opinion. That's probably the kindest thing I can say about him. He proved it at Yorktown, and he proved it throughout his entire command. Um, his he was arrogant. He was thinking that he would be the hero of the Civil War and possibly the next American president if he took Richmond. And he had a very low opinion of Lincoln. He loved himself in a mirror, and that's about the kindest thing I'll say about him.
All righty. A little hard to read this one, but can you, it was a question, can what was the Confederate planning versus what actually occurred? And then a comment, very good, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, the Confederate planning, Johnston didn't communicate his plans well. He did have a golden opportunity. He didn't complain to communicate his plans well with Longstreet, nor did Johnston lead as a commander should. He gave orders when it became apparent that they were falling apart. He did nothing to try to save the day. He didn't show any aggressiveness to try to save his plan. It wasn't until Longstreet notified him near 4 o'clock that victory was near at hand that he actually did move forward again. It's a shame on the Confederate end because they had a masterful. You talk about what ifs. This is one of the first what ifs on the Confederacy in the early part of the Civil War.
Let's see the questions on the Everbright site. This is listed as part 2 about the Seven Pines battle. Is a recording of part 1 available? Yes, in the chat. If you go to the very top, we have put Abigail has put the link to the part 1, which is on YouTube. What was Lincoln and Stanton's reaction to the results of the battle?
Well, they were greatly influenced by McClellan's account that Kearny had saved the day and that they had actually won a battle. Lincoln, of course, was starving for any victory at all. And when he believed McClellan that there was a victory, he also thought that there would be a press forward. So the belief in Washington was great. We've won. Now let's move forward. Which of course they didn't. McClellan did not move forward. The opportunity was there to do so, but he chose not to. And at the same time, they were concerned because Stonewall Jackson was in the valley near Harper's Ferry, and he was raising havoc there. So they were happy on the one hand that it looked like McClellan had won a great victory and that they would soon take Richmond. On the other hand, they were concerned about Jackson, but turned out it was all for naught because McClellan went back into his turtle shell.
All right. Let's see, a couple more questions. Assuming a Confederate victory and Johnston not being wounded, would this battle have had an effect on the outcome of the war? There's a second part to it, but that would be the first.
Well, had Johnston not been wounded, no, their opportunity was, as I said, they had a huge opportunity, even though the plan was not operationalized at all like they envisioned. Had there been that aggressiveness when those two flanks, when Jenkins on one end and Rhodes on the other end had crushed Casey's division and driven it back, that was a vulnerable time. Had there been another force, that division that was with Johnston, 11,000 men, had they moved out at that time, it would have been a convincing victory. But they didn't. And that's even with Johnston. Once Johnson moved too late, it was too late. That was it. After that, the opportunity was there. He just needed to show aggressiveness to do it.
The second part to Chris's question, which I think you've answered really, did Johnson have the aggressive and strategic vision to capitalize on his victory?
No, no. He basically, when things didn't start out the way he planned, he was he was actually hoping that things would just peter out on their own. Uh, he lost. He came up with a good idea and a good way to do it, but he didn't involve himself in actually operationalizing it, and that's shame on him.
Right. Uh, Next question. How did Lincoln put up with McClellan for as long as he did?
well, it's politics is a big part of it because in McClellan's case, he was a war Democrat and he had a lot of popularity with Northern governors, Democrat governors. And so since he had so many of them that he needed their soldiers to fill his ranks, uh, that's one reason why he tolerated him. Plus, he didn't really have anybody else at the time that he could trust to win. Grant hadn't turned into Grant yet. So, that's probably the best answer I can give you. At the time, he was thinking that this is the best I've got, and it's not really the best, but it's what I do have.
Yep. Make do with what you got.
Yes.
Other questions? Otherwise, I had one. I'm curious, Victor, from your perspective, the layout of the five corps, the third and fourth just seemed like off partying on the side. How did
Yeah.
that fit into McClellan's thinking of siege? I couldn't quite see. It does, or was it he was starting to move him into position? But as diagrammed at that battle, it didn't look like it made sense.
No, and it's perplexing because McClellan's focus, his writings at the time, his communications at the time, even the ones that aren't published in the official records, the ones that are in the Library of Congress, just the notes that you got to go through and just look at all that microfiche. Um, he's not talking at all about the third and fourth corps. He's more concerned about getting McDowell. And that he wants to get McDowell because he wants to get his siege guns in. He wants to move everything up from his White House landing supply depot. The thinking is possibly to move to an area near Old Tavern from where the artillery guns could reach the city of Richmond. Um, the ground where the fourth corps located and the third corps were located was basically a swamp area. It wasn't considered an area that you could do an operational movement from. Um, so that kind of played into it, but it also played into it that you have to be on that side of the river in order to take the capital. So it is perplexing why, especially the fourth corps. I mean, you've got Casey's division out there. McClellan detested Keyes. He absolutely detested Keyes, and he had the weakest division, knowing the weakest division, and they're at the tip of the spear, and they weren't supported. Had the second corps been on the other side of the river, it would have made more sense. But he was trying to hedge his bets until the first corps could get there. And I'm thinking the key was the first corps. He was hedging everything, that Johnston wasn't going to be active because Johnston had always retreated in front of McClellan throughout the entire campaign. So he did not suspect that Johnston was going to be aggressive. Therefore, I don't think he considered it much of a risk. that's the theory I'm going to go with in the next book. Somebody will probably find out something and disagree with me, but that's the one I'm going with.
Alrighty, we have one more question here. What efforts did McClellan make in communicating to his corps and gaining an eye on the battlefield positioning and Confederate locations?
What did he do? He did
Yes.
nothing. Yeah, he did nothing. He um, he arrived during the early morning hours of June the 1st, actually late in the morning on June the 1st. So he had never been on the field itself when actual fighting was occurring. The telegram he sent the night before was all based on um, information given to him by Heintzelman, and it was not anything that he had gained firsthand knowledge of. So he didn't know of the positions, and I think he was pretty much thinking, you know what, let me just see what's going on here, and we'll move on from here. But I'm not thinking that um, it just wasn't his nature to take advantage. Grant would have gone through and said, okay, if they're rolling now, let's take our entire army and rush through and follow this up. That's not the kind of General McClellan was. He was going to want to make sure all the ducks were in a row before he moved forward. So he had no aggressiveness on that end, looking out what the enemy was doing.
All right. Fits in maybe with a siege mentality
Yeah.
from that perspective.
One
Yeah.
question, one question.
Please go ahead.
The History Channel of Victor had a series on Lincoln, a 3-part series. The second part of the series was how Lincoln went through many generals before he finally came upon General Grant.
Right.
And he, needless to say, did not think much of McClellan either.
Right.
But apparently, I would just wanted your opinion. He didn't think a lot of many of the other generals until he came into Grant. So,
Right.
do you have an opinion on any of that? Because it wasn't just McClellan; he had a few others he didn't care for.
Well, yeah. I think. See, and I'm not a Lincoln expert at all, but he had the difficult job of trying to manage politics with, you know, the military aspects. And the politics of the North is, remember, in 1864, before he really, well, he just latched on to Grant in March of 1864, right, or actually February of 1864. Until then, he's thinking, I'm a one-termer. I'm not winning re-election. So he's thinking, how do I keep the country together? In my opinion, how do I keep the country together? Re-election, I don't think was number one. I think winning the war and keeping the country together was number one. And the reason he was having such difficulty with people was like, he had to balance politics all the time with look who he picked to be, or he didn't pick, but I mean, his party picked. They picked Andrew Johnson to be his running mate. He's a Democrat. When would you ever have a Republican pick a Democrat to be their vice president? So when you think about it, everything was done with a political taint to it. He had to cater to political governors up north. He had to cater to so many factions, as well as trying to keep the country together. So I think that part, that constant balls in the air kind of a thing, is what it was with generals. He just wanted a general who was going to win and have aggressiveness to go out there and win. And
Thanks for your opinion. I think you're right on. McClellan did not come across well in this series, along with a pile of other generals who didn't come across well.
No, well, Pope was a disaster as well. Meade, I think he short-shrifted him because Meade, I think, was better, but he wasn't a Grant. Grant, put it this way: I joke with people all the time. The reason my books will never sell is because I don't have the Holy Trinity. I don't have Grant, Lee, or Gettysburg in the title, so I'm done.
Victor,
I
well,
just,
well,
I'd like to make a
excellent.
comment about Lincoln because, as I understand it, he also had a learning curve. In the beginning, he
Yes.
wasn't a military man, and
Yes.
he had to learn to be one.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Yes. Yes. He had a, yeah. Yes. That's a wonderful point. Thank you for bringing that up.
On that note, read through all the thank yous, great presentation, fantastic presentation, etc. Thank you very much for your time. It was excellent. And to all our attendees, thank you for attending. Appreciate it.